Yeah, thank you very much, Tiziano, for inviting me, and thank you for all the presentations and the very rich and illuminating materials that you've brought out. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this idea of industriousness or industrious modernity, which is a sort of a book that I'm working on now and hopefully conclude sometime. I think one of the most important things that we need to think about in order to put this stuff in context, both the platform labor and the Airbnb phenomena and all of these things, is that we're in a situation right now where a particular type of capitalism, like an industrial version of capitalism, which is built on mass production for mass consumption, is in a situation where it's becoming, on the one hand, increasingly entrenched in a social model that is inherited from the last century, but also increasingly inefficient in doing what it's trying to do. Right? So participating in sort of the official model of industrial capitalism is less likely to become a source of livelihood and careers or even survival for an increasing amount of people. At the same time, industrial capitalism itself is also becoming less apt at doing what it's supposed to do, that is to make money and engage in capital accumulation. It's a sort of a stalwart in a sense where growth is going down, profits levels are going down, and most of the business is moved over to financial markets instead, where as a consequence we see an overabundance of resources and of capital, right, that are looking very actively for investment objects. One of the reasons why these platforms are so incredibly valued, Uber is valued at $50 billion, it's never made any profit. Facebook is valued at almost $500 million right now and makes a fairly modest, I mean a substantial but fairly modest profit. It makes profits around, I think, $6 billion a year right now. Is that there is so much capital around that's looking for investment objects that the few things that are there that seem to be even minimally promising attract these enormous amounts of investments, right? So for example, a lot of people are talking now about the cash hoarding on the part of multinational companies. Multinational companies now have more cash reserves than they ever had before. I think only Apple is now sitting on $250 billion in cash, which of course for a capitalist company is sort of not ideal because it shows that you don't really know where to invest that money in, right? And at a certain point at the heart of this problem, I think, I mean, there's of course a whole complex sociology about path dependency and entrenchment and all this sort of stuff, but there's also a cultural problem. It's a problem of not being able to imagine a future that's radically different from what we have right now, right? I mean, Apple seems to be unable to imagine anything beyond the iPhone, or maybe, and the ecosystem that they have in a sense, right? Whilst, of course, and a situation like that is very unlikely to be able to deal with the sort of enormous changes that are coming over us in the remainder of this century, and the enormous sort of transformation of planetary living conditions that people now refer to as the Anthropocene, the geological era, where human activities have become a fundamental force in altering the environment, not simply the human environment, but the environment of the planet itself, is bound to realize social transformations of such magnitude and dramatic complexity that a system that is not even able to invent beyond the iPhone will simply not be able to deal with that type of transformation which is coming over us. Right? So that's a little bit the scenario. So the thing is, what are we seeing instead, right? I mean, I think one of the important things, if you look like empirically at things, I mean, one of the most significant trends that involve all this platform economy and all these other things is that we've had a trend going on basically since the 1990s, whereby capitalist companies have been retreating from the production of goods and services. Production and goods and services is increasingly outsourced to smaller actors that are less capital intensive. Right? Doesn't mean that it's not still controlled by large multinational companies. On the contrary, at the same time, there's also be a process of continuous capital concentration, so that the concentration of power, and above all financial power, to a small number of large actors is much stronger than what it was before. But the actual productive activity is increasingly undertaken by actors that are sort of effectively pushed out of capitalism, in a sense, right? That are relegated to what you can call to labor-intensive, capital-poor, and often small operators that often operate in conditions of very intense market competition. Right? And that's what I refer to as industrious rather than industrial. Right? So industrial is the type of capitalism that we know. It's capital-rich. It's based on monopolizing and sitting on markets, and it's based to a large extent about rent extraction, and it's about sort of substituting labor for capital, capital for labor in large processes. Industrious instead is a situation where you have sort of the other way around, where you are engaged in market competition, earnings are very low, there's high degrees of labor intensity, and there's very little capital. And the industrious part right now of the world economy is growing, and has been growing in importance for the last 2-3 decades or so, as a part of of corporate restructuring, and this started to invest sort of labor, actual material production in the 90s, when you see the emergence of sort of first industrial districts and global supply chains, and the shifting out of production from large corporate factories to sort of large networks that's spanning the globe. You also saw it in the in knowledge work in the 1990s with the emergence of the creative industries, which is basically nothing but the outsourcing of corporate services to smaller, more capital poor and more entrepreneurial actors, particularly with the arrival of the digital economy and the web, etc. And we've seen it with innovation in the last decades, a substantial sort of disinvestment in large corporate laboratories, and a shifting out on innovation to either factory floors or more recently, of course, startups, right? Which is in a certain sense is a way of outsourcing innovation to these type of labor-intensive and essentially capital-poor actors. And we're seeing it also now with the whole transformation of the advanced service economy. You can call it the hipster economy if you want, which in a certain sense is a result of the type of urban restructuring that are coming out of these new wealth differences that result from this type of concentration. Right? So we have this process of a sort of a shifting out. I like to talk about it as a refeudalization of capitalism. Right? In the Italian 16th century, you had a process of refeudalization of sort of Florentine merchants stopped being so interested in taking risks anymore anyway. The business was being shifted over to northwestern Europe, so you tend to buy country estates and sort of grow olives and take less risks and sort of sit on. And that's basically what the capitalist class is doing right now, I think. Like there's a growing risk adversity and there's a growing sort of self-referentiality. And at the same time, there is then and sort of a lot of people are being thrown out of the system, either pushed out of the system because it doesn't offer any opportunities anymore, or they're actively choosing to leave because you think that you might find a more satisfying and meaningful life engaging in some entrepreneurial venture on your own, etc. So it's a combination of factors. It's a combination of sort of the very process of capitalist restructuring, which tends to shift production over to more labor-intensive actors. There's a push out of people. This is particularly true on the one hand. You have like on a lower level, you have an enormous sort of push out of people who are forced or choose to migrate from their points of origin and go live in new places and new circumstances, and who have sort of labor-intensive, market-related industrious activity as the most viable option for making a living. Right? And at the same time, you also have this among knowledge workers, where you see a constant overproduction of university graduates in Europe, in the US, but also increasingly in countries like India and China, and where you have basically a whole generation who are less and less likely to find the type of career that they were trained to expect within participating in the official capitalist economy, and who are increasingly pushed into becoming freelance workers or working for these type of platforms that Alessandro was talking about, etc. Right? So there's a bit of a convergence between the two. Essentially what I think that you're seeing in a sense is a convergence between the productivity levels of the popular and the knowledge worker segment. Right? To a certain extent, if you go and look at the figures, and we've done that a bit also with Alessandro and in Milano and others, that people who are knowledge worker freelancers in co-working spaces don't make that much money. Right? They earn 800 euros. I think the medium income in Milano was 800 euros last time we looked, and it's substantially not really changed since the time before that, which was in 2010, but it was also around 700-800 euros as a medium income, which of course means that they're being supported by their families, because you can't live on 800 euros in Milano. But that's sort of a way in which, I mean, for example, I saw this, I was in this startup forum, and it's like a story I like very much, because I was in this startup forum in Basilicata, the small piece of Basilicata that actually goes to the sea, right? It's called, I don't remember what it's called. It's very, Marate, yes, very beautiful, with this sort of Christ statue and everything. And they had this startup forum, and in the lobby of the startup forum, there is this guy who, he was an architect, parenthesis, about 80% of the people working in co-working spaces in Milan are architects, so they don't work as architects, they do other things, but there's a substantial overproduction of architects in Italy, right? But this guy is an architect, and he makes sort of ice cream, and he has this very cold plate on which he mixes like natural ingredients, and he makes like, you know, you makes your own bespoke ice cream, so to say, right? And this is very nice and everything, and he picked this up in Bangkok. He was traveling in Thailand, and he saw people on the street in Bangkok do this. They have these like things, little wagons with these cold plates, and they make like ice creams, and you can choose your own ingredients, etc. And he was sort of presented as an excellent startup, right? Someone who sort of made a career out of his passion for ice cream and making it. But if you think about it a little bit, I mean, how much money does he make by making this bespoke ice cream in probably not much more than the guy he saw on the street in Bangkok, right? I mean, at least not that purchasing power parity, as the economists call it, right? I think that he's probably sort of he's an example of something that I call the Bangkokization of the world, which is another term that I like to throw around. And this is essentially, so I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Bangkok, but Bangkok was one of the cities in the 80s and the 90s that had the absolute fastest growth rates in the world, right? Because the Thai economy was the big sort of tiger, one of the big Asian tigers at the time. And a whole generation of people were sucked up into sort of corporate modernity, either coming from the countryside and working in factories, or coming from the middle class, going through university, and then working in communication and advertising and corporate services, etc. And in 1997, the Thai bath collapses, which is the origin of the Asian financial crisis. And this whole generation is basically thrown out on the street overnight, right? There's no jobs anymore. Skyscraper construction stops. I don't know if you've been to Bangkok, you can see there are a couple of like cement skeletons that are sort of skyscrapers that stopped building in the mid-90s. And what you get from this is like a enormous sort of ferment of small-scale industrious businesses in the capital, right? The people who used to work in factories buy motorbikes, and they become motorcycle taxi drivers, which become like an enormous phenomenon around the whole city. And the people who used to work in advertising come from families where there's a tradition. Maybe a couple of generations ago, there's people have been selling things on the streets, so they start sort of more designed and branded street vending operations, like little designed bars or coffee shops and things like that, right? And so you have this sort of transformation into a labor-intensive, small-scale entrepreneurial economy where earning levels also between the two, between the knowledge workers and the motorcycle drivers, are basically converging towards the same thing, right? So one of the theses that I have in this is like what you're seeing now basically is like a global trend whereby the retreat of capitalism in a certain sense, and its decreasing ability to meet the needs and desires of ordinary people is being filled up by a new wave of industrious, labor-intensive entrepreneurship, which to a large extent can work and can be so capital poor because it has access to all the new digital commons that we all know about, right? Free software and digital communication platforms and the internet and all these sorts of stuff that I won't talk about because all you know about this very well, I'm sure, peer production and all this sort of stuff. And that is increasingly sort of emerging to fill up these cracks left by a capitalist economy that's going to be less and less able to sort of supply, to live up to its promises. Like Wolfgang Streeck, this German sociologist, talks about industrial capitalism as a sort of rotting corpse that nobody has the force to take away, right? That sort of remains in the middle of everything and then have to find ways around it, right? And this is in a certain sense a situation that's not without historical parallel. It's very similar to what you saw in the, well, basically in the High Middle Ages around the 11th, 12th century. You see a very similar development in, at least in Europe, with the emergence of what Ricardo Lopez calls the European commercial revolution. You know, a lot of people that are being sort of dislocated or fleeing the countryside, moving into cities and engaging in market-oriented, labor-intensive commercial activity, and then forming different types of institutions like corporations and guilds and all this sort of stuff around it eventually. Right? So the question then is sort of what type of future can you have? Can you think? I mean, that's what Tiziano asked right now, to think about the future around this. I mean, I think that right now there are like 3 different ways in which this thing is being institutionalized, right? And one, of course, is the platform economy, right? The platform economy. And with the platform economy, I also count sort of the venture capital startup system. They're very integrated. They work in very similar ways. And one of the main scopes of the venture capital sort of startup system has been to generate more platforms, or generate more potential platform ideas, at least. That's a system, of course, that's been very well described by all the speakers. I won't go in and discuss it very much. I think it's safe to say that it's based on 2 things. One thing is it's based on a very significant standardization of what's being created. Right? Platforms, of course, are about standardizing services. We all know that, right? It's supposed to, every Uber ride is supposed to be similar and comparable to the other, every Airbnb experience, etc. But also the startup venture capital system is essentially a business of standardizing innovation, right? Because if you look at what happens very much, it's not so much about stimulating innovation. It's about making sure that innovation, this type of innovative industrious activity, is basically directed into the same funnel. Right? You make, in order to achieve seed money, you have to perform a very particular type of not only startup project, but also startup personality that makes you very similar to everybody else. And the whole system is very much about sort of training people to behave and think like everybody else, in a sense. So in that sense, I think as a result on the part of industrial capital to this new type of industriousness, startups and venture capital are essentially about making sure that that everything sort of goes in the same direction and everything becomes more of the same. And it's also not really geared to creating any sort of viable businesses, any businesses that make money by actually selling something that people would like. It's more geared towards creating objects for financial investment. And that follows a very different logic. It doesn't really need to have much, you know, you don't need to have much in revenue creation or even a sustainable business model in order to acquire funding for a startup. And that's, I mean, all the platforms that we talked about are basically a proof of that, because none of them are actually making any money, right? Uber is losing lots of money. Airbnb is making a bit of money, but about 1/3 of it comes from a venture capital fund that they've started. So they make money mostly from that, and Deliveroo, Foodora all are losing money. Facebook makes a very modest amount of money. Amazon, yes, but in relation to its market valuation, it doesn't really make a lot of money. It's one of the most valuable companies, but I think it's somewhere around number 59 and something like that in terms of productivity, etc. So it's not like a great idea. And so the thing there, I think, that type of model is not really working. It's not even working for capital itself. Like investing enormous amounts of money in platforms and unicorns is not a particularly rational thing to do, not even from a capitalist point of view. So in response to Fuchs and all these other people, I would say that the problem is not so much that there is exploitation, the problem is that there isn't any exploitation, right? Because I mean, the only, as Giovanni Arrighi said, there's only one worse thing than being exploited by capital, and that's not being exploited by capital, because that means that you live on $1 a day in outskirts, and that's actually what's happening, right? I mean, the platform economy is not really able to utilize these new productive resources in a way that is rational enough to create a surplus that can somehow be distributed, even if it's exploitative, right? It's not able to do what the industrial economy was able to do, right, at the time. So in that case, it's also because if there's no exploitation, it's even worse, because then it means that there's no rationality, right? I mean, if there's exploitation, at least there's a rationality, but if they're not even able to do. So that, I think, is not really a viable object, right? And then you have another sort of possible or other way that's also existing is, of course, the whole sort of commons-based peer production, creating, you know, more movement-inspired way of institutionalizing these things, right? And that's an interesting, a very interesting development, and also is the source right now of a number of innovations in terms of finding new types of solidarity structures, value sharing, alternative currencies, recreating old guild-like structures is also something that a lot of people are doing right now, rediscovering these things, right, or creating different types of new forms of cooperative organizations, etc. The problem with that also is that there's significant problems of economic sustainability in that world, right? I mean, these initiatives are either not making enough money, or depending on public money, or depending to a large extent on corporate investments, etc. Right? This is when you look at the Fab Labs and co-working space. Fab Labs in Milano, for example, are almost entirely dependent on either grants from the municipality, sometimes the European Union, or the fact that they provide experiences for corporate clients, like, for example, they have a Brico, what's it called? Not Brico, the other one, the big Merlin, Leroy Merlin's person then go there and learn what a 3D printer is and stuff like that. So it has a lot of, it struggles to find autonomy, right? And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that the peer-to-peer part shares something with the startup venture capital universe, which is a very scant regard for use value. So there's a very strong idea that since I have an idea, I can implement it, in a sense. Right? Since I think that it might be useful to have a Fab Lab, we'll make a Fab Lab. Right? But I don't really care about the fact that so much as if the Fab Lab is actually useful to anyone, right? It's a type of they're both following the disruptive paradigm, right? The disruptive paradigm is the sort of the ideology of disruptive innovation, which basically is some sort of economic Nietzscheanism, right? You don't really have to think about what people need, you just have to change the rules of the game, and eventually someone will need what you're doing, right? So in that sense, I think it's more right. And the third part is, I think, what you could call like the global pirate economy, right? And that's, you have like in Asia, in Africa, in South America, but also in Naples, it's quite prevalent. There's like a global network of small-scale tinkerers and traders that are supplying stuff that ordinary people need through self-organized type of global distribution systems, right? Cheap smartphones and gaming consoles produced by overcapacity in Chinese industrial districts, which are at the time also now going through a process of reconcentration of capital. Foxconn, the infamous Foxconn, is firing 10,000 workers this year and sort of replacing them with robots. So the time of sort of cheap Chinese workers is going away as well. So there's enormous overcapacity in these areas that is linked up to these type of global networks of suitcase entrepreneurs. You go with a suitcase to Shenzhen and you fill it up with smartphones, and then you go to Lagos and sell it on the street and stuff. And you use like a lot of innovative forms of financial transfer and lots of future for sort of blockchain applications in that area, I think, right? And partly regulated by, with a very complex regulatory environment where also, of course, organized crime has an important part, but not only, because there's also a number of other types of sort of religiously inspired forms of solidarity and other stuff like that that's going on, right? So these are basically the three, I think, areas in the sense that this thing is being institutionalized in right now, and that this type of the pirate economy is of course has an advantage because it has a real attention to use value. It's something that's based on sort of breeding with the market, looking what the market wants, and being very flexible in responding to it, right? I mean, I think that a possibility that's quite interesting is like that since you have like a convergence in productivity levels, that there's also at least an economic possibility for a convergence also in forms of consciousness and solidarity, right? I mean, right now that hasn't really happened. The people who are working in co-working spaces in Chiang Mai that we were and studied some time ago, and the people who are driving them back and forth on motorbikes to their hostels might make the same amount of money, but they still believe themselves to appear to different separate universes where very sort of strong cultural differences prevail. But I think a possibility of sort of putting together the pirate economy and the peer-to-peer economy, the knowledge worker part and the more popular part is quite interesting and quite promising, and in a sense also, to a large extent also what's happened before, because of course the emerging sort of bourgeois, the burghers, the city dwellers, the bourgeois that came out of the escape from feudalism, of course, sort of went through that type of recomposition. They were both relatively wealthy, relatively poor, relatively educated and relatively less educated, and sort of merged together over the centuries into a common type of consciousness and a common subjectivity. So that, I think, is one of the thing that's quite sort of interesting in terms of future dynamics, is this type of putting together. And in terms of sort of, and I'll finish, I think, now, but in terms of future scenarios, I think that what we can see, I think, is like, I mean, of course, all these things will be around, right? I mean, it's not either or. I think we have to think about the coexistence of all of this. Like, on the one hand, I think we are seeing like a sort of a Chinese-style capitalism, right? A Chinese-style capitalism, which is based on labor-intensive, industrious work, also entrepreneurial and markets, and combining that with despotic control, possibly exercised through algorithms. I mean, that's like a quite direction, I think, in which you can think about as another model after an American-style industrial capitalism. And then, and the other position, of course, is some sort of new Puritan revolution, right? I mean, the peer-to-peer people somehow manage to unite and create some sort of ideology that is able to create a different kind of modernity, not necessarily what they imagined in the first place, a bit like Max Weber's Puritans, who are sort of able to create some sort of ideological cement that ushered in modernity and driven by a sort of essentially a middle class of small-scale industrious producers as well. And the third is like simply this type of Blade Runner scenario of sort of back alley entrepreneurs that will sort of provide whatever you need in a time of civilizational collapse. And that's the other thing. But that's basically some combination of the three, I think, is like the most likely, the way in which like the coordinates for some sort of future development, I think. Thank you.